On a warm summer evening in a quiet small-town neighborhood, the soft hum of a motorcycle broke the usual stillness. Heads turned as the bike glided down Main Street, its rider sitting tall and confident. He was unlike anyone this town had seen before, not just because of his leather jacket, not just because of the rumbling bike, but because he was a black man riding through a community where diversity wasn't just rare. It was almost non-existent. His presence was a statement, bold and unspoken, and it stirred something deep in everyone who saw him. This was Marcus Hall, a man known for his unshakable courage and unwavering belief in justice. To him, the bike wasn't just a machine. It was a symbol of freedom, resilience, and the power to move forward, no matter what obstacles stood in the way. He wasn't there to pick a fight or prove a point. Marcus had come to this town for a reason far more personal and profound. But before we get to that, you need to know what kind of place this was. For years, the community had lived under an unspoken rule. Stay in your lane, keep to your kind. It wasn't outright hostility that ruled. It was the quiet, insidious kind of racism that lingered in whispers, glances, and unspoken boundaries. People here weren't used to seeing someone like Marcus walking into their diner, nodding politely to strangers, or parking his motorcycle outside the town's only bar. And that made them uncomfortable. Not everyone, of course, but enough to create tension in the air, tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus felt it, but he didn't flinch. He had faced worse before. Growing up in the city, he had learned that standing tall wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room, but about being the calmest presence when things got tough. And tonight, as he stepped off his bike and walked into that diner, he carried that calm with him. His purpose was clear, though he kept it to himself. He wasn't here to change the world, just this little corner of it. Inside the diner, the usual chatter came to an abrupt halt. Forks froze midair, conversations trailed off, and eyes turned toward Marcus. He noticed the hesitation, but smiled anyway. He greeted the waitress with a polite, "Good evening," and took a seat near the window. Slowly, conversations resumed, but the tension didn't fade. It was there in the way people whispered behind their hands, the way they avoided eye contact, and the way the waitress's hands trembled slightly as she placed his coffee on the table. But Marcus didn't come here to confront anyone. His mission was different. He had a story to tell, a story that could break down walls if people were willing to listen. But how do you get people to listen when they've already decided who you are? That was the challenge Marcus faced, and it was a challenge he couldn't tackle alone. Unbeknownst to Marcus, someone was watching him closely, someone who would change the course of this story in a way neither of them could predict. Sarah, a young waitress in her early 20s, had grown up in this town her whole life. She had heard the same stories, absorbed the same prejudices, and lived under the same unspoken rules. But there was a curiosity in her that set her apart, a quiet yearning to understand the world beyond the confines of this town. She watched Marcus that night, not with suspicion, but with intrigue. Who was this man? Why had he come here? And why, despite the unease in the room, did he seem so at peace as? The evening wore on. Marcus struck up small conversations with those who dared to meet his gaze. He complimented the food, made a joke about the weather, and even shared a laugh with the older man sitting at the counter. Slowly, the icy atmosphere began to thaw. People started to see Marcus not as an outsider, but as a person, someone who could laugh, share, and connect, if they gave him the chance. But not everyone was ready for that. In the corner of the diner, a group of men sat watching Marcus with narrowed eyes. They weren't amused. To them, Marcus's presence was a challenge, a disruption to the status quo. One of them, a burly man named Hank, muttered something under his breath, loud enough for Marcus to hear. The comment was sharp, cutting, meant to provoke. For a moment, the diner fell silent again, waiting to see how Marcus would respond. Marcus looked up, his calm demeanor unshaken. He met Hank's glare with a steady gaze and said, I found that the best way to understand someone is to have a conversation with them. I'm happy to start one if you are. The tension in the room was palpable. Hank hesitated, caught off guard by Marcus's measured response. But before anything more could happen, Sarah stepped forward. She placed a hand on Hank's shoulder and said, "Come on, Hank. Let's not do this tonight." Her voice was soft but firm, and for a moment, Hank seemed to consider it. With a grunt, he backed down, and the room exhaled a collective sigh of relief. Sarah's small act of courage didn't go unnoticed by Marcus. He nodded at her, a silent thank you, and she smiled in return. It was a brief moment, but it marked the beginning of something neither of them could yet understand. By the time Marcus left the diner that night, the air felt different. He had come here with a purpose, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, he knew one thing for sure: change was possible. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but the first step had been taken. As Marcus rode his motorcycle back into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that this town, with all its walls and wounds, was ready for something new. The question was, would they be brave enough to face it? And would Marcus's story be enough to spark the change he hoped for? Stay with me as we dive deeper into this journey. A story of courage, resistance, and the power of human connection. What happens next will test the very fabric of this community and reveal truths that some would rather keep hidden. You won't want to miss it. The next morning, the town woke up to a lingering buzz of conversation. Marcus's presence at the diner the night before had stirred something in people: curiosity, discomfort, maybe even a little admiration. Some brushed it off, saying he was just passing through, but others weren't so sure. A man like Marcus didn't seem like the type to just come and go. And they were right. Marcus had a reason for being in this town, and it was more than just a road trip. A week before, he had received a letter from someone he hadn't heard from in years, his old army buddy, Raymond Tucker. Ray had grown up in this town, but had left for the military, just like Marcus. Unlike Marcus, though, Ray had come back. And now he needed help. The letter had been short, almost cryptic. "Marcus, I don't know who else to ask. Things here ain't right. People don't change easy, and I'm running out of options. Come if you can. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious." That was all it said, but it was enough. Marcus and Ray had been through too much together for Marcus to ignore it. They had saved each other's lives more than once overseas. And if Ray needed him now, Marcus wasn't about to turn his back. But as Marcus rode his bike through the town that morning, he could tell that whatever Ray was dealing with, it wasn't going to be simple. He felt the eyes on him again, the cautious glances, the lingering stares. Some people seemed curious, others wary. And then there were those who made their disapproval clear. At a stop sign, a truck rolled up beside him, its engine revving aggressively. The driver, a man Marcus didn't recognize, gave him a long, hard look before spitting out the window onto the pavement beside his bike. Then the truck peeled off, tires screeching. Marcus just shook his head. He had seen this kind of thing before. When he pulled up to Ray's house, he immediately noticed how run down it looked. The porch steps sagged, the paint was peeling, and the front yard was overgrown. But before he could knock, the door swung open, and there was Ray, looking thinner than Marcus remembered, with tired eyes that had seen too much. "You actually came," Ray said, his voice rough but relieved. "Of course I did," Marcus replied. "What's going on?" Ray glanced over Marcus's shoulder, as if checking to see if anyone was watching. Then he stepped aside and motioned for Marcus to come in. Inside, the place was sparse, like someone who had stopped trying to make a house feel like home. Ray poured them both coffee and sat down at the kitchen table. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face before speaking. "You remember how it was when we were deployed?" Ray started. "When you didn't know who you could trust. When you felt like you had to watch your back every second." Marcus nodded. "Yeah, I remember." "That's how it feels here now," Ray said. "Only difference is, I ain't overseas. I'm in my own hometown." Marcus leaned forward. "Talk to me." Ray hesitated for a moment. Then he said, "You ever hear of the Blackwell family?" Marcus shook his head. "They own half this town, businesses, land, even the police chief answers to them. Been that way for generations. People here don't cross them unless they want trouble. And I guess I cross them." "How?" Marcus asked. Ray let out a slow breath. "I spoke up. Started asking questions about some shady stuff going on. Land deals, money disappearing, people getting forced out of their homes. I didn't think I was doing anything wrong. Just trying to do what's right. But when you're up against people like the Blackwells, right and wrong don't matter. Power does." Marcus was silent for a moment, letting it all sink in. Then he asked, "What kind of trouble are you in, Ray?" Ray looked him in the eye. "They want me gone. They've made that clear. First, it was warnings, little things, slashed tires, broken windows, threats left on my porch. Then it got worse. My boss let me go from the construction job I had, no explanation. My bank started losing my paychecks. And 2 nights ago," Ray paused, his jaw tightening, "someone ran me off the road. I walked away, but they weren't trying to scare me that time, Marcus. They were trying to finish it." Marcus's expression darkened. "Why didn't you go to the police?" Ray gave a humorless laugh. "The police? They work for the Blackwells. Reporting it would just paint a bigger target on my back." Marcus leaned back in his chair, processing everything. He had come here expecting trouble, but this was deeper than he thought. "So what do you need me to do?" he asked. Ray hesitated. "I don't know, man. I just knew I couldn't handle this alone." Marcus nodded. "Then you won't have to." Later that day, Marcus decided to take a walk through town, get a feel for things. He stopped by the diner again, where Sarah was working. She looked surprised to see him, but smiled anyway. "Back so soon?" she asked. "Figured I'd grab a coffee," Marcus said, "and maybe some conversation, if you're up for it." Sarah glanced around, making sure her boss wasn't watching, then leaned on the counter. "You're not just passing through, are you?" Marcus smirked. What gave it away? "The way people are acting," she said, lowering her voice. "This town doesn't like outsiders, especially ones who aren't afraid to stand their ground." Marcus took a sip of his coffee. "That a warning?" She shook her head. "Just an observation." Then she hesitated before adding, "Be careful, Marcus. There are people here who don't like change, and they don't like people who try to bring it." Marcus met her eyes. "Thanks for the concern, but I've never been one to back down from a fight when it's the right one." Sarah studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Just watch your back." As Marcus left the diner, he could feel the weight of the situation settling on him. This wasn't just about Ray anymore. It was about the whole town, the way fear kept people in line, the way injustice thrived in silence. And if there was one thing Marcus Hall had never been good at, it was staying silent. That night, as Marcus sat on Ray's porch, the quiet was shattered by the roar of an engine. Headlights flashed, blindingly bright, and then bang! A gunshot rang out. Marcus dove for cover as tires screeched, and the vehicle sped off into the night. Ray ran out of the house, breathless. "You okay?" Marcus straightened up, his jaw set. "Yeah," he said, "but I think they just made their biggest mistake." Because Marcus wasn't the kind of man to scare off. If the Blackwells wanted a fight, they were about to get one. And this time, silence wasn't an option. The echoes of the gunshot still rang in Marcus's ears as he crouched behind the porch railing, heart steady but mind racing. Whoever had fired that shot wasn't just sending a warning. They were making a statement. Leave now, or next time, it won't be a warning at all. Ray paced beside him, hands clenched into fists. "This ain't just scare tactics anymore," he muttered. "They're getting desperate." Marcus stood, dusting himself off. "Good," he said. "Desperate men make mistakes, and I'm about to make sure they regret this one." He wasn't about to wait for another attack. It was time to take control of the situation. He had spent enough time observing, understanding the town's power structure. Now he needed to push back. The next morning, Marcus rode straight into town, his bike cutting through the uneasy silence that followed him. People watched, some from behind their curtains, others right out in the open, whispering. They had heard about the gunshot. They knew lines had been crossed, and they knew what it meant when a man like Marcus didn't run. He parked outside the Blackwell family's main business, a real estate office that was more of a front for their power. Marcus stepped inside, the door chime ringing through the quiet space. Behind the desk sat a well-dressed man in his late 40s, eyes cold, mouth set in a firm line. James Blackwell. James leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus with thinly veiled amusement. "Well, well," he drawled, "you must be the new troublemaker in town." Marcus didn't bother with small talk. He walked right up to the desk, placing his hands flat on the polished wood. "Last night, someone fired a shot at me," he said. "That was a mistake. One you and your people are going to fix." James smirked, shaking his head. "I think you misunderstand how things work around here." "No," Marcus said. "I understand just fine. I understand that you built this town on fear. That people keep their heads down because they're afraid of what happens if they don't. But here's the thing, James, you don't scare me." For the first time, James's smirk faltered. He studied Marcus, measuring him, trying to decide if he was bluffing. "You think you can just roll into my town and change the way things are?" James asked. Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "I don't need to change the whole town," he said. "I just need to show people they don't have to be afraid of you anymore." James chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Marcus pulled out his phone and placed it on the desk. "By showing them the truth." He hit play. A recording started, voices, clear as day. James's voice, one of his enforcers. A conversation about how they had forced Ray off the road, how they had set up illegal deals to keep control over the town, how they had planned to make an example out of anyone who got in their way. James's face darkened. "Where did you get this?" Marcus smiled. "Turns out, not everyone in this town is as loyal as you think." James stood, slamming his hand on the desk. "You think this little stunt is going to change anything? You think the people here will suddenly grow a spine and stand against me?" Marcus didn't have to answer, because at that moment, the door behind him opened, and the townspeople started walking in. Ray, Sarah, the old man from the diner. One by one, they stepped forward, filling the office, their presence speaking louder than words. For years, they had lived under James Blackwell's rule. But now they had seen proof. They had seen a man stand up when no one else would. And it had given them the courage to do the same. James looked around, realization dawning on his face. The tide had turned. "You can try to hold on to power," Marcus said, "but when fear is gone, power disappears with it." James clenched his jaw. He knew he had lost. By the end of the week, the sheriff, once too afraid to act, had no choice but to arrest James Blackwell and his men. The evidence was undeniable, and the town was watching. Justice, for the first time in a long time, had a voice here. Ray finally got the peace he had been fighting for. The threats stopped, the fear faded, and the town, though still healing, had begun to change. And Sarah, she became one of the strongest voices in that change, ensuring that people never went back to the way things were. As for Marcus, he didn't stay. He had never planned to. His job here was done. On the morning he left, Ray stood by his side, watching as Marcus strapped his helmet on. "You sure you don't want to stick around?" Ray asked. "Could use someone like you here." Marcus grinned. "You don't need me anymore," he said. "You've got this." Ray nodded, understanding. Marcus looked around one last time. The town felt different now. Lighter, freer. And as he started his bike and rode away, he knew that change didn't come from just one man. It came from people realizing they had the power to stand. And today, they had finally stood.